afternoon. I'm a teacher at heart, so as I go through this presentation, you don't have to hold your questions to the end. If something is confusing, please raise your hand and I will address it. This may be a little long. If I run out of time or if my time is running short, apologies. I tried to kind of condense as much information into this talk as much as I could. So without further ado. The People Not Property Project is part of a larger production called the Digital Library on American Slavery. It houses databases such as the Race and Slavery Petition Project, the Runaway Slave Advertisements, and the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. Each database provides a unique view into the history of American slavery. For instance, this is an example of a petition from Buncombe County, 1824. It reads, 19 Buncombe County residents expressed concern about the increasing number of free blacks in their midst. They realized that they need not bring to the view of the honorable body all the many evils and inconveniences arising from the undue portion of this idle and marauding description of persons, and that they are immoral, idle, desolute are facts of ill repute whenever they are numerous. The petitioners further argue that the free people of color infuse corruption and a spirit of insubordination into the slaves. Having had enough of this unfortunate, troublesome portion of our species to feel them a public nuisance, they therefore pray that additional tax be imposed on all persons of color now resident in the state, on such as may subsequently immigrate and settle amongst us, as a capitation tax of $50 per annum. What is this all about? As you read this kind of primary source, what do you gain from it? I'm going to solicit some answers. What do you think? You need a little bit more context? Just a little bit more?
I think whenever they are numerous is an interesting phrase.
Right. Why would you say that?
Well, that's still a contemporary issue, that there's something that happens that there are a number of African Americans together. There's more of a focus of police presence. And
Right. Good.
White people.
Good. Anyone else? So let's put this into some type of perspective. The free black population in 1820 was 33 persons. 33 persons. In 1830, it jumped to 92 persons. Now, I'll put this in more perspective. In 1820, that's about 0.3 of the population. In 1830, it's about 0.6 of the population. What are your thoughts now? What's happening? What's taking place? The white population in 1820 was 9,500 people in 1820. In 1830, it was a little under 15,000. The numbers are staggering, right? But when you think about the free black population, it's not as much. So what is the problem? We'll get to some of this later in the talk. But let's kind of just deal with some questions. Was it the evil of blacks? Was it that they had that much of a problem when their population was so low? Even the slave population. In 1820, the slave population totaled around 1,000. In 1830, it jumped to about 1,666. So how much influence could they have had on such a small population? What was this really about? When we began to kind of look and rethink history, what you begin to see is that the free black population was labor competition. Even a small number could kind of cause some problems, right? So think about this as potentially labor competition. This is an example of a slave ad. This reads, a bright mulatto woman named Piety, about 16 years old. She has a scar under one of her eyes, occasioned by a fall. Her upper 4 teeth are somewhat decayed, rather slim made but tall of her age. $10 reward would be given if taken in this county and secured, 20 if out of the county and secured, or 20 if out of the county and secured, so that I get her again. It is supposed she passes for a free woman. 1808. From this primary source, what type of information can you gather as a researcher? What is it telling you about slavery? These petitions, these ads are within the database, and they're full of slave advertisement that reads very similarly. What did we get? Yes.
Yeah, it was saying that her upper four teeth are somewhat decayed. It's just like highlighting like the treatment of slaves.
Okay, good.
And how common practice it was, and how easy it was for people to treat them that way.
Good. What was one of the major reasons for teeth decay in the antebellum South? It shows a lack of nutritious diet. All right, rickets. Right. Start to lose teeth. Right. This is part of it. What else do you see?
They're not describing her in a positive, favorable way.
Okay.
They're describing her by scars and bad teeth and kind of the negative parts of her life.
Good, good. You have this kind of intimacy that happens with slavery. To have this amount of information about your enslaved person demonstrates that you are in close proximity with them, right? To know a person, to know their scars is to know them, right? What else? What else did we get from this? Yes?
The rewards. So they're, I'm not sure how like it measured up as far as like what equal to today, but they're offering what I'm assuming will be a low reward for a human being.
This is about average, right? But average means that this person is worthwhile, right? We want this person back. Yes?
But it's interesting to compare this amount of reward versus the amount of tax that the petitioners were willing to put on.
Right. Good. Good. Perfect. That's what we want to do with the databases, is kind of see how they help to explain American slavery by cross-pollinating these databases, asking different questions. That's what the database is really all about. Good. Anything else? Yes?
The passage for a free woman, that just means that she's identifying as someone that's not a slave anymore? That what it means?
Yeah, potentially passing as a free woman, that demonstrates, and that's something that goes with that, is that she is a what? Bright mulatto woman, right? That she has this ability to pass as a free woman, right? Demonstrating there has been some intermixing quite a bit, all right? Good, good.
Does Bright describe her color or does it describe her intelligence, you think?
I think it's mostly describing her color, right? Because you have this kind of shades of mulatto women, all right? So the People Not Property Project is a 3-year initiative that's looking to identify, digitize, and transcribe property deeds related to slaves to create a searchable database. People Not Property is a public history project that is based and founded on Buncombe County Slave Deed Project. The project is much like the well-known WPA narratives because it touches the human level. We are extracting slave names from deeds, providing researchers and casual users with a plethora of information about people who have been hidden in the sources for hundreds of years. By developing a systematic and text-searchable database, we hope to provide genealogists, casual family researchers, and historians a new way to explore American slavery. These records not only touch on the cultural and social aspects of American slavery, but also on the economic, political, and legal aspects of American slavery. One of the major perks of having access to several different databases in the digital library on American slavery is that we find that persons revealed in the slave deeds may intersect with other databases, such as the case of Lydia and Jeffrey. We possess both the deed and the average slave runaway ad for Lydia and Jeffrey. Now, the deed notes that Jeffrey, Lydia, as well as her 2 children were sold to someone else, all right? When you begin to kind of think about this in terms of why Lydia ran away, think about it. She ran away, she had 2 younger children. Why did Lydia run away? Why did Lydia run away? The deed notes that she had 2 children that were sold with her. Yet we find that she ran away. Yes?
Maybe to try to have freedom for her children, perhaps?
Okay, good. Good, precisely, that's good. What else? Runaways, what do we know about runaways? She had 2 children, she's leaving them behind. Is that motherly? Is that something you would consider to be motherhood? No? Right? Good, good. She's also, as she sold with a man named Jeffrey, Jeffrey also he runs away with her. Is this her husband? Potentially. Who is he to Lydia? These questions we really don't know. But some of this information we can actually, when we begin to kind of look at both the deed and the ad right beside each other, we begin to unlock a lot more information. Yes?
At what point does she run away? But
After she's sold.
After she has been,
Yes.
well, after she's been moved to
Yes.
another situation.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry, I should have clarified that. Yes.
So Lydia and Jeffrey and 2 children.
Yes.
In one package.
With more slaves, a few more slaves, not
Okay.
many.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
To a new place, and then just the 2 adults.
Yes, the 2 adults run away.
Run away.
Why is she running away? The slave ad noted that they may be lurking in Murfreesboro, where they were sold. Now, what kind of clue does that give you? Precisely. She may be going back to visit her other children. All right? This is what, when you begin to kind of think about the deeds and how the slave acts may actually help to reveal more information about the deeds, we begin to kind of unlock different threads within this history. And that's the power of it. And then if you think about Jeffrey, Jeffrey also may be actually going back to visit his family, his wife, his children. And this becomes very important as we begin to kind of think about and rethink slavery. Historically, males dominated runaway ads, but scholars have positioned their resistance without kind of noting how this may be a concept of manhood. We know that almost 50% of all runaways were running back towards family. And this has been dominated by men. It may suggest that there is something within this man that signifies that fatherhood is important to life. And so how do we actually rethink runaways from that standpoint? And this is something that I think the Digital Library of American Slavery and the databases that it houses can kind of get us to rethink these things. At this point in the People Not Property project, we can use your help finding the deeds, downloading the deeds, and tagging them with document IDs. Locating slave deeds are not always easy. Depending on the county, it may mean wading through several land deeds before actually finding one slave deed. But locating them is essential to the next phase of the project, which is transcribing. Once we have completed our slave deed search, downloaded and ID each slave deed, we will transcribe the deeds, which will make these deeds text searchable to researchers and other historians. If you're in the kind of the mode or the mood of volunteering, I actually have some bookmarks that I'll lay out. So where we are right now, we're looking for people to help us find these deeds within county records. So if you're available, if you have the time, we can use your help locating these deeds. You had a question? Yes?
Yeah. What is the typical process of finding a slave deed?
It's really going into a deed book and searching for certain keywords and eventually enslave people. It's really a straightforward process, but it is a very tedious process. Very tedious process. Any other questions? All right. So I'm going to move on into kind of an overview of slavery resistance in Western North Carolina. Before I do that, I do like to start with a bibliography. Usually this comes at the end, but when I have not done extensive research on a topic, that means that I'm heavily relying on other scholars, and I like to kind of mention them before we actually start. And so some of the people I would like to mention that I'm really kind of using is John Inscoe, which no doubt I'm sure most of you know, Wilma Dunaway, Marvin Kaye and Lorraine Carey, Freddie Parker, and the late John Blassingame are some of the scholars that I'm relying on for this talk. It is important to give a brief look into the colonial period because it not only provides the context of slavery in North Carolina, but it is literally connected to the growth of Western North Carolina. The story of North Carolina begins as a part of Virginia, but as it becomes its own state, the story mainly starts in the Northeast, East, and not long after in the Southeast. And here, this map kind of indicates this, the one on the right, where you have Ottomar County which is eventually broken up into different counties. But this is where the state gets its beginnings. And we have to kind of understand what's happening in this colonial period if we are to understand slavery in the antebellum period. Slavery in North Carolina has not grabbed the attention of scholars as has slavery in Virginia or South Carolina. The reason for this, according to Mary Kay and Lorraine Carey, is that slavery in North Carolina was a late settlement and had a comparatively immature slave economy. Its immaturity lies in the fact that it was based on a diversified production, including tobacco, lumber products, naval stores, grains, and other provisions. North Carolina lacked the unique cash crop to which merchants could draw vessels from Europe. The late development resulted in North Carolina containing fewer slaves, lacking an extensive plantation economy and a planter elite. In fact, colonial North Carolina, with the exception of Maryland, yielded the smallest slave population. That is, to note this is also to understand that slavery did exist before its first slave code in 1715. And this slave code was based also on Virginia's codes of 1705 and 1699. At the time, it was estimated that the enslaved population of colonial North Carolina ranged between 800 and 2,000. These numbers vary depending on who you ask. Under these laws, whenever a slave left the plantation, they were required to have a ticket or a pass from the master, which stated their destination and the reason for their travel. The 1715 code also prevented slaves from gathering in groups for any reason, including religious worship, and required whites to help capture runaway slaves. Ernest Clark noted that the slave codes had two purposes. The first, the code was intended to be a police system for controlling the black population. Second, it was intended to establish and maintain a unique social order based on race. In essence, the law was to ensure white over black. As Kay and Carey put it, North Carolina, through slave codes, social definitions, and practices, effectively limited enslavement to non-whites and defined slaves as chattels. With almost no legal protection of their persons, whose permanent status passed from mother to child, enslaved people would come to know the law as an enemy. And this is also kind of a quote from the famous North Carolina slave case, State versus Mann. Here is a map of European migration into early North Carolina. It is important to understand the settlement patterns because they intersect with the migration of slaves, the history of war, death, and displacement of Native Americans, as well as displays the ethnic and the eventual class divisions among whites in colonial North Carolina. All right, so all of this stuff becomes important. These people are only able to move in certain locations as they are displacing Native Americans. As they are moving into certain locations, they are also traveling with their enslaved populations. Does that make sense? So we have to kind of look at this colonial period to understand how North Carolina is developing. Most inhabitants of North Carolina migrated from other states, as you can see, migrated from other states, which is explained in this map. North Carolina had a large number of slave immigrants. Most of North Carolina slaves were Creole. I know that's a word that we usually use at this point, those based in Louisiana, but early on, Creole meant you was American-born, all right? And they had African-born slaves who were re-exported from other states, all right? So there wasn't many African-born Africans who actually went from Africa directly to North Carolina. Most of them came from other states. Yes?
When they're coming down, I know some of them here are coming down with Great Philadelphia Wagon.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't bringing slaves. I don't know where were they? Were there slaves in the North?
I'm not wholly sure. There are sources that says yes, and there are sources that says no. I haven't kind of went into that debate extensively, so I could not say. I couldn't say. Any other questions? North Carolina lacked a substantial number of Africans being directly imported into the state because vessels had a difficult time traversing the Carolina coast. Plus, without a major cash crop, there was not a huge reason for risking a vessel, all right? So one of the reasons why there is a lack of Africans being directly imported into the state is because the coast was treacherous, all right? And without a cash crop, without something that was gonna make these European money, it wasn't worth the risk, all right? It wasn't worth the risk. But there are other reasons that we have to consider. Oh, that's my notes here. In 1759, a law was passed to force those who migrated slaves into Virginia from Maryland, Carolina, and the West Indies to pay taxes on their property. The law noted, whereas a great number of Negro and other slaves imported to the provinces of Maryland, North Carolina, and other places in America have been there brought by the inhabitants of this colony and from thence transported hither, whereby not only the payment of duties on slaves have been evaded. So what was happening? North Carolina was serving as this kind of hiding spot for people to kind of not have to pay taxes on their imports, in this case, their slaves. Once there was a kind of people stopped looking for these taxes, they will actually migrate back into Virginia. All right, so there was a law passed to somewhat prevent that. So where North Carolina at times would have a larger population, that population would immediately decrease as these merchants would move back into Virginia. That makes sense. The other reason is they lacked, the second reason they lacked a large slave population, as I noted before, is because they lacked a cash crop. A colonial record noted, this lack of staple acceptable to England prevented her merchants from sending vessels to the colony and also made them unwilling to grant North Carolina planters the liberal credit which was necessary if they were to become heavy purchasers of Negro cargoes. North Carolina didn't have anything that the merchants wanted. So as a result, there was a lack of growth in the slave population. The third reason was that the obstacles to actually obtain slaves were also difficult as the reason why we didn't have a large slave population in the colonial period. Speaking of the problems of buying slaves and complaining of the type of slaves purchased in Virginia, Governor Burlington of North Carolina noted, those who take such pains to carry provisions to Virginia at the charge of a great land carriage do it chiefly to lodge money there to purchase slaves, which are difficult to be brought any other way. The slaves thus obtained were by no means satisfactory. Great is the loss this country has sustained in not being supplied by vessels from Guinea with Negroes. In any part of the province, the people are able to pay for a ship's load, but as none can come directly from Africa, we are under the necessity to buy the refused, the refractory, and distemperate Negroes from other states. So in essence, the slaves that North Carolina was getting were the ones that other states did not want. They were the ones that were causing problems. And we kind of see this early on as we began to see the marooning in that northeast corridor when we start talking about the Great Dismal Swamp. All right? Despite the slow start, North Carolina did have one of the fastest growing slave populations, mostly because there's room for improvement. Kay and Carey noted, slaves in the coastal regions had become as concentrated on large plantations as they were in Virginia. And by the 1760s, the concentration of slaves on large plantations in the lower Cape Fear region paralleled concentrations in South Carolina's low country. So we do begin to see some increase of the slave populations in those major dominant areas I noted before, that northeast, kind of southeast region, what we call the Cape Fear region, and the kind of eastern part of North Carolina. As you can tell, slavery was a major financial investment, often a major profit driver. Resultantly, those who were planters often ruled their societies. The ruling elite had a large role in shaping society in their image and for their benefit. What is often noted by historians is how slaveholders crafted laws and policies to their advantage. What is usually overlooked is how they were able to craft laws and policies by convincing others of their culture, meaning they set the assumptions and the values of society from which the other classes based their worldview. It seems very basic or subtle, But what I'm trying to demonstrate is that oftentimes historians have looked at the laws and demonstrated how the laws help the planters actually grow their wealth. What is usually lacking from that analysis is how the planter class actually infused their culture into the other classes that allowed them to rule their societies, meaning they created the assumptions by which people determined their worldview. If that makes sense? Okay, just want to make sure, because that could be kind of thrown out there. The planter class not only held law and policy making in their hands, but also the power to ostracize, to include, to socially punish and reward, which in many cases held more power than the courts. And if you think about it, even in our day, if someone is shunned on social media like Twitter, it could be real bad for them, right? It may happen in the court, you may not hear anything about it, right? But public opinion plays a huge role, and what we have to understand is that the planter class had control over the public mind. Through this power, meaning cultural hegemony, slaveholders were able to exploit and harness the natural resources, both land and people, including slaves as well as lower class whites. So I'm trying to also make that connection, that money plays a huge role in this. Class, race is kind of up under all of these things. This is about power. Initially, the slaveholding class did not desire to convert the slave to the ruling class values. Masters frequently preferred to withhold their culture from slaves. This pushed slaveholders to focus on gaining legal, political, military dominance over their human property. So you got to recognize what was the goal here, was pure domination. Not going to teach them about our culture, we're just going to dominate them, all right? This type of domination that slaveholders desired over their human property helped to establish a cultural precedent, which we call racism. Racism is about domination, ideological and structural. And because slaveholders dominated society's culture, most of the white population, for more than one reason, adopted a racist ideology of the planter class. So this is one thing I'm trying to show, that the racist ideology stemmed from the planters' desire for money. And because they had control over culture, they was able to infuse this racist ideology into the rest of society, in which was adopted for multiple reasons. One of those reasons is what David Roediger calls the wages of whiteness, all right? This idea, psychologically, I am better just because I'm white. Doesn't have to be anything tangible. I am better than a black person merely because I'm white. That was the wage of whiteness. The ruling class, through a draconian relationship with blacks, learned to view all non-compliant and unpredictable behavior of blacks as out of place and criminal. Criminal and black became synonymous. This early period is important. As we talk about the 1715 slave code, what we're noting, what we're trying to get at, is that black and criminal became synonymous at this point. All right? The slave patrol was created to prevent the criminal, and the criminal being the black. All right? If you can recall the petition to control free blacks mentioned earlier, do y'all remember that petition? As to what was really happening there? Now you can begin to see what was taking place. Free blacks coming into our county, the numbers are not great, but they seem to be what? Out of control. Too much mobility, it's too many of them. As a result, what is happening in the mind, how the mind works culturally, they begin to understand these free blacks as what? Y'all remember the language they use? Evil. They are criminal. So this is why you will emphasize 60-something more free blacks coming into a county and not say anything to the thousands and thousands of whites that are actually trickling into the county. This is how this is working. This is how it is playing out. How am I on time? I don't want to go too far over. Okay. Nonetheless, the unwillingness to socialize enslaved people into ruling class values gave the enslaved more space to forge and develop through a mixture of ethnic backgrounds their own culture. It is in this space of cultural autonomy that enabled the enslaved to use their imagination and creativity to develop a point of reference and carve out interpretations of their plight and worldview, and create a worldview that would allow them to survive physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually the slave experience. And the point of reference developed by the enslaved was steadily opposite of the slaveholder view. Because of that fact, the slave culture, by definition, was consciously and unconsciously a culture of resistance. It was not a culture of resistance because it opposed the slaveholder's worldview as an end of itself, but rather it was resistant because the slave experience forced slaves to adopt and understand a different form of human relations. And this is something I think historians have also overlooked. The way they always kind of discuss resistance is always in regards to the slaveholder's ideology. What is usually lacking from that analysis is that the slave, through this experience of slavery, is forging a worldview that is forcing them to think about human relations from a different standpoint. They want something entirely different. They want an entirely different, new arrangement of social organization. Something that is not seen. This is what, at times, something they call heaven, right? They call that heaven, this new way of being. Thus, resistance, let me make sure I hit that. Thus, resistance, like running away, was not only defiance or the culture of resistance expressed in the moment, but a larger call for a new arrangement of society. The enslaved desired equality, not just equality, but equity, and an end of slavery wherever it existed and permanently impeded on freedom. So if you think about the slave worldview in this moment and how they kind of resisted any form of slavery, they would look at the wage system and say something's not right about this, right? It looks eerily familiar, the way it is taking away time, right? Because this is something that the enslaved began to understand as valuable as spending time with family, having time to self, leisure to a good extent. So anything that impeded on freedom permanently, they viewed as slavery. And this is something that we have to begin to rethink and craft as to what did the enslaved people mean by freedom. Often we read those words and we think abstractly about them, but they meant something very tangible, very tangible. Before the 1750s, Western counties developed very slowly because of the lack of transportation and urban developments inland. However, the years after 1750 witnessed signs of a maturing economy. As population ballooned and settlers established hundreds of new farms, considerable roads, bridges, and urban buildings, it witnessed an increased number of merchants and county stores in western North Carolina. This growth in turn boosted the production of naval stores, lumber products, grains, and livestock. Their byproducts helped to continue the expansion of tobacco growth and production from the northeast to the north and the central inner plain Piedmont regions. As the economic significance of towns rose during the 50s to 60s and the 70s, 1750s, 1760s, 1770s, the number of seaport towns that played an important commercial roles gradually declined. Hence, the concentration of power in the northeast and in the southeast sections of the state began to rotate to other spaces of the state. So what we begin to see in the 1750s on through the 1770s is that the power dynamics that is located in the northeast and the southeast regions of the state, as people begin to shift west, that power begins to also shift west. All right? So what that also means is that we also will see slavery being carried into more places out west. The increasing scale and networking of operations of merchants in coastal and Midlands, this is very dark. I apologize. I should have not made this so dark. The increasing scale and networking of the operations of merchants in coastal and midland towns helped to stimulate the Western movement in commercial and farming towns. Hillsborough and Salisbury both began around 1754, and Salem and Charlotte in 1766. All of this in turn both aided and reflected the colony's growing dependence on slave labor. The development of slave economies in the colonial South intertwined with the improvements of roads, river systems, and harbor facilities. So in essence, what this slide is getting at is that what is really pushing European migrants to actually go west? Mostly it's slave labor. They're doing a lot of the work that are crafting roads. They're actually helping to create river systems and make these rivers navigable. So this becomes important as we begin to go west. In other words, with the foundation of slave labor, North Carolina was able to create an infrastructure that not only aided in commerce and exports, but in turn attracted more people, particularly merchants and investors. Their presence increased the commercial infrastructure and increased land speculations for new investments. This not only led to westward expansion, but also increased the slave population. Expansion was driven by the economy, and the economy was driven by slave labor, all right? I do have a kind of a modern example of this. If anybody is familiar with Charlotte, Charlotte is kind of booming at the moment, and this is kind of a modern day example. Charlotte GDP is one of the leading in the Southeast. This in turn produces what? Jobs, hence attracting more people, which is labor. This drives other things like what? Housing, public works, right? And as people see that there's more housing, this also, in turns, excites investors to what? Speculate even more. And so now you have this kind of cycle of boom. And this is what's also happening in North Carolina in the late 1770s. Oops, wrong way. Despite the growth, the profit orientation of North Carolinians also slowed the expansion. Because slavery was a slow-growing feature, it allowed those who would settle in North Carolina to imagine a world not regulated by slave ownership and a market orientation. Thereby, many North Carolinians developed a true yeoman mentality. In essence, they started to recognize that we don't really desire slaves like that at times. They had this kind of yeoman mentality, meaning they had this kind of world imagined by self-sufficiency, right? Subsistence farming. Only grow what you need. If you have surplus, you barter it with other people. That was the kind of lifestyle of some North Carolinians. And as a result, that sometimes slowed the progress and the growth of North Carolina. Due to the nature of North Carolina slave economies, the type of work the enslaved people did varied according to where they worked. The plantation size affected occupational structure and work organization, among other things. Large plantations typically had a wide range of specialized work. But due to the fact that North Carolina was a land of small farms, highly specialization of skills was not characteristic of the type of work slaves did in North Carolina. Most enslaved people worked on plantations with fewer than 20 slaves. Thus, enslaved people did agricultural work alongside masonry, carpentry, butchery, etc. In many cases, slaves worked alongside their owners. Historians have long argued that the type of work enslaved people did on North American plantations was comparable to the situation or the task-oriented approach used in West Africa. Thus, adjusting to work in North America was not too hard. In fact, there are several instances where slaves had organized the plantation work to make it more efficient because of what they were doing in West Africa. Now, this was not done because they actually liked the work that they were doing, all right? They didn't like being slaves. But in most cases, when they did reorganize the work on the plantation, it freed up more time. Remember, they are learning what is valuable, and time is one of those things they recognize as most valuable. Despite the adjustments enslaved people made, work in America was not the same as in Africa for obvious reasons. Absconding or running away, arson, stealing were examples of slaves resisting the way they worked, how they worked, and the strain of work under the system of slavery in North America. In regards to running away, slave owners reacted to the loss of labor by seeking legislation to regain their labor and property. Not only that, but seeking to put their property back under their control and back into their place. Fugitive slaves often disrupted free communities because they not only stole, but at times they were harbored by free blacks and whites. All right? So when you start to think about this game that's being played out in slavery, this resistance and counter-resistance that's taking place, you have to recognize that when a person runs away, the slave owner has to come up with a way to what? Prevent that. And one of the things that they did was go to the law, which we kind of referenced earlier, but I will come back to it now. To prevent the avenues of fugitive slaves, the 1715 Slave Code included a Fugitive Slave Act that forced all North Carolinians to be in the business of returning slaves. Those who captured enslaved people were rewarded. The law demanded that if a white found a slave without a pass, they had to make an arrest. Think about what this law is doing socially. They had to make an arrest. And those who chose to harbor slaves were fined. The 1715 Slave Code also compensated owners at public expense for the loss of life of an outlawed slave killed during apprehension. Again, think about what this law is doing to the mind, to the public mind. If a slave was killed before 1741 by a bounty hunter or some other, justification was needed, meaning if you're trying to capture a slave and you actually kill him or her, you had to justify what happened and why you killed them. After revising the slave codes in 1741, outlawed slaves could be killed without justification, and the slaveholder was still compensated. All right? I'm moving quickly through this law and a whole lot of things, but I'm doing this to note how slave codes shaped the dynamics of slavery as well as the public mind. It created a public mind that served the foundation of racism, which placed blacks in a certain place, real or imagined, to which mobility and freedom was not permitted. This is what it's doing. It's teaching people to do what? It's conditioning people. A black without a pass, they're out of place, and as a result, they are what? Criminal, right? Black and criminal become synonymous. And John Blassingame, to a good extent, discussed the mentality, this arrangement. He noted that slaveholders, to kind of help them wrestle with the problems of slavery and the threat of insurrection, they had to develop 3 slave personalities in their mind: Sambo, Nat, and Jack. Sambo, Nat, and Jack. The preferred way to look at enslaved people was through the lens of the Sambo, all right? One who will kind of show affection, that will smile, that will do everything to please the master. The other one was Jack. Now, Jack was the one who would, saw his wood quietly. Just don't mess with him. He's going to do what he needs to do. He's going to be a decent slave. He's not going to cause any problems. But if you mess with him and you push him, he's going to be a problem. Nat was always the problem, right? Nat Turner, as an example. Nat was the problem. You didn't want a Nat. So slaveholders created this psychology for themselves to deal with slavery, according to Blassingame. And so when you begin to see a black out of place, without a pass, your response is to view this slave as a what? As a gnat. All right? This is it. This is the psychology that's being created. Now, this is also doing something else. Blackness was, to a good extent, used as a unifier of white solidarity. In fact, Philip Morgan noted in his article titled Slave Conspiracies. In this article, he argued that whites used the fear of black insurrections to quiet class and status problems within the white community. This created white solidarity. So blackness is not only something that is used to be synonymous with criminal, but it's also used to unify whites and quiet problems within the white community. All right? He used, I think, maybe 3 or 4 cases where there was this kind of fake slave conspiracy that is happening in South Carolina. But it's going on simultaneously when there's kind of this class crisis that is happening in South Carolina. Because of this law, because of how whites were somewhat conditioned to think about blacks being out of their space, they was willing to forego the class problem to focus on what? The potential slave insurrection. All right? And this becomes important as to why these codes are necessary to think about. 5 minutes. Okay. I have a lot. I apologize.
My question was around, I saw up to Salisbury, but what about further west, like Buncombe County? Like why was there slavery? You mentioned the other areas to Charlotte, Hillsborough,
Right.
Salisbury, but can you get us over here to Buncombe?
So we begin to see the growth of the mountain counties in the early 1800s. One of the reasons why it is marching very slowly is because of a very well-known group, Native Americans. All right? They have to deal with this. And we, again, underestimate how important they are to the history of slavery. But Cherokee and Tuscaroras play a huge role in the history of North Carolina. In fact, one of the reasons why we see the 1715 slave code is coming after the Tuscarora War. And so all of this plays a role. So as I'm slowly marching there, I do begin to kind of discuss, some characteristics of slavery in the mountains to kind of get us through what's happening and what was slavery like in the mountains. I'll try to get through as much as I can, and if we have some questions, I can get there. I can do that as well. By 1802, the growth of the mountain population began to increase rapidly, mostly as Cherokee lands become available to whites. The earliest settlers in western North Carolina were able to acquire large tracts of flat and fertile, well-irrigated bottom land. This, plus access to trade routes and markets, made these first landholders successful in both raising and selling crops. So as I noted earlier, just a few minutes ago, Native Americans are in these places. And so there is this kind of early push, even before we have the Native American Removal Act in 1830s, they're already kind of being pushed out. As in the rest of the South, farming was a mainstay in western North Carolina's economy. And most of the mountain residents were engaged to some extent in agricultural pursuits. But without the predominance of any single cash crop, the range of crops grown was as wide as those grown in other parts of the state. Some of the major crops that we see are corn, tobacco, apples, grapes, peaches. They also produce things like buckwheat, rye, flax, molasses, cheese, butter, and wool. Livestock dominated the mountain agriculture because the mountains provided a better climate than the lower south. The east was humid and hot, prone to parasitic diseases, and the poor forage yields. Highland countries were much more suitable for animal husbandry. The minimum manpower required to tend flocks and herds, their adaptability to the variations of the mountain topography, and the ready access to major markets made the raising of cattle, sheep, and particularly hogs an integral part of almost every mountain farm, regardless of its size. As such, livestock demanded not only the majority of a farmer's land, but also much of the grain produced. And what we also got to keep in our mind that although there was many advantages to owning land and becoming a planter in western North Carolina, western North Carolina remained one of the poorest places in the state. One of the major things that also helped to increase the growth of slavery in western North Carolina was tourism. Hotel owners were one of the largest slaveholders in the mountain counties. Those were thus where cotton, sugar, indigo, tobacco would be the story and the symbols of slavery with most slaves. Hotels, spas, or springs at that time would be kind of the symbols of slavery for those in the mountain counties. The mountains offered views and cooler temperatures, and this also played into kind of summer tourism. And local residents quickly capitalized on the visitors that they had from May to October. One of the reasons why you do have this influx of people coming to the mountains during May to October is for what reasons? Anybody know? Say it again? Malaria and yellow fever. These diseases are reaping havoc in coastal areas like Georgia and South Carolina. And as we march towards what we consider to be this kind of sectional crisis between the North and the South, there was much more emphasis on actually staying in the South. This actually increased those who actually went to places like Asheville, where we are now, all right? Are we out? Okay. I guess we'll stop here for questions. Apologies. I did have a lot. I was trying to go as fast as I could, but we're running out of time. It's fine. Any questions? Yes.
You mentioned North Carolina getting a lot of the reject slaves and whatnot,
Mhm.
which would include problematic slaves.
Yes.
So did North Carolina have an increased amount of runaways and whatnot? Or
It's going to be hard to compare because North Carolina still remains one of the states with the smallest slave populations. We are almost done with the slave ads, at least that database. We're about 75% complete. And once we finish that, I am going to kind of do the numbers to kind of measure what was the numbers like for at least North Carolina. And I probably can compare it to Virginia because I think Virginia has completed their database, and I'll try to compare the two states. Good question. Yes?
Can you talk about Cherokee slaveholders?
I don't know much about Cherokee slaveholders. What I do know is why we begin to see the influx of Cherokee slaveholders. And that is because of the split between the Native American populations. Because the Tuscarora dominated the East, the Cherokee dominated the West, there was this kind of relationship with the Cherokee and the English that the Tuscaroras didn't have. So one of the reasons why we do see Cherokee slaveholders is because of that type of relationship they had with the British. However, based on some of the sources that I did find, is that many of these Cherokee slaveholders actually purchased slaves to be a part of the tribe or the family and become a part of the family. But the sources are kind of sketched as to how far we can go with that. Same as what I found with the Carter G. Woodson wrote a book called the Free Negro Slaveholders. The two slaveholders I found in the mountain counties, they only owned one slave. Were they benevolent or not? I can't say, but we do see free blacks also being slaveholders as well. Say it again?
The names of those people?
Let's see, I could probably try to move quickly. Let's see. I may have them, I'm not sure. Oh, I don't. I think I have them in my notes. So if you ask for them, I can get them to you. Any other questions? Let's see.
Do you have a image of a slave deed from this area of a person? I think the library for the images that are up there is the enter.
I don't think I extracted one from the database. Apologies. No, I did not. I didn't put it in here. I did not.
The database is open to the public at buncombecounty.org. If anyone would like to search Buncombe County slave records, please feel free to go there. Or the Digital Library of American Slavery is searchable at UT Greensboro website.
And I failed to mention this, but our Register of Deeds is here, Drew Geisinger.
And my partner in crime, Deborah Miles, who helped me get a lot of stuff around.
And we all know Deborah.
Nice to be home.
All right, any more questions? Oh, yes.
Yeah, so you're working on the digital registry for North Carolina. You just mentioned that Virginia has a similar one.
Well, in terms of the slave runaway advertisements, they have that database as well. I mean, many states, I think Virginia, Maryland has it. So if you want to kind of capture the differences of slave runaways from Maryland to Virginia to North Carolina, those databases are available to the public.
But North Carolina is the only state that's doing the three.
So far, yes, that's what we see. And part of the slavery race and petition project is coming from a scholar named Lawrence Schlesinger. He has done and wrote a number of books on those subjects, and what he did is donate his research to UNCG and ProQuest, and we're borrowing from that. So that is a one-of-a-kind database as well.
Is the intention then, to cross-reference all of those?
That is our hope. But because sources are scattered, and again, the number of, let's see, almost 330,000 slaves existed by 1860. Was the slave population in North Carolina by 1860. We're only going to get maybe a small number of those, maybe 10, 15, 20%, and we'll miss a lot. But where we can cross over into the different databases, that will be the richness of what the databases has to offer.
And the third type, was it petitions? Is that what you
Yes,
call?
race and slavery petitions. It's kind of court documents.
Now, the one you showed us was very general.
Yes.
Let's tax everybody. Are there other ones then that name individuals so that?
Not really, because it is a court case. You may have the name of the slave, but not much more information other than that. For instance, there are a number of cases where someone has stolen somebody's slave, and they're kind of taking them to trial and trying to get their slave back.
What happened with the petition that we saw? Was that approved, not approved?
And that's the other thing, is some of these things we can't kind of determine. There are in the records of the Supreme Court where they say, it's rejected or approved. We'll have to go and kind of collect and kind of see, but they're scattered. And so kind of learning and finding them and connecting them is also kind of a tedious task.
Where was that one filed?
I think that was Lenoir County. Lenoir County. Yeah. Yes.
This might be, feel free to say if this is out of context, but I'm curious your thoughts or insights about how the psychology that you kind of laid out for us with the landscape of what were the values and why people were trying to get free and how that connects to the psychology today. Like what are we seeing as the consequences or as the trickle down of what you're presenting and talking about from a historical standpoint?
That's a tough question. One, because of just the timing. What I can say, and what I think is important to note, is we have to pay more attention to culture and how laws are shaping the mindset. One thing that I'm working on at the moment is focusing on a basic definition of culture and how African Americans have used culture throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century to kind of get us to understand how did African Americans go from the different desires that they had during slavery, and particularly at the time of Reconstruction, to the desires they had in the 1950s and eventually the 1980s, and what happened culturally to determine the different thoughts that they had, particularly the leaders.
And is that something you're going to publish?
Hopefully, eventually. It's going to take a while. Right now, I'm still looking at definitions of culture, and I'm looking at how culture is used within the enslaved population. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
I know you said that North Carolina had a relatively small slave population
Yes.
in comparison to the other.
Yeah, when you get to like Virginia, South Carolina, and many of those lower South states, they kind of increased quite a bit. It's not that far off, but it's still smaller.
How does that? What have you seen? How that relates to resistance in the form of assault?
What do you mean?
Like resistance on the slaves' part, assaulting slave masters.
Okay.
In North Carolina, in comparison to another state or North Carolina in general, how that works. With
You don't see a lot of assault, only because that could create larger problems for the community. One of the things we have to keep in mind is that this was a community-focused type of culture, so they looked out for other people even when it was very personal. It was also thinking, how does this affect other people? And so insulting a slave master may mean consequences for somebody else. You do have cases, Frederick Douglass, if you're not familiar, he beat the brakes off his slave owner at the time, and that actually caused him to not be beaten ever again before he escaped. So you do have instances of those cases, but I don't see a lot of that.
It's so easy to find cases like that whenever you're in regular media without really delving into it, which is what I was curious about, what you've seen as someone who's actually worked.
If there was a problem, a major problem, for instance, not getting the pass to go see family, slaves would just run away for a few days, a couple months, maybe even a couple years. And the community knew of these kind of what they call runaway dens. All right, these are places so they'll go visit this person who has ran away because they knew where they was. The other thing is they will also steal things from the slave owner while they're running away. They'll take a hog and they'll actually share it with the rest of the slave community. So there is this kind of community-oriented approach to resistance that is sometimes hard to capture and understand because of our kind of individual way of thinking about life at this moment. But they are always considering the community for the most part when they're resisting. And that's why you kind of see the forms of resistance that we see. Again, runaway is one, stealing, kind of signs of humility, right? Again, bowing, showing signs of affection, even though they are not really affectionate toward their slave owner. It's just kind of what Langston Hughes calls the mask that grins and lies, that hides our cheeks and saves our eyes. This is kind of part of it. And today, what you see, and you kind of ask this question, you see that also what we call code switching, right? This is kind of that continuity of that. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, as you uncover so much disturbing information, what helps you carry on with your research?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
As you're uncovering so much disturbing history, what helps you carry on with your research?
I guess it's the way I'm looking at it. So, and I find some of these stories to be kind of hilarious at times. For instance, it's not funny, but this is maybe one of my ways of coping. There was a slave in Asheville who had run away. His owner, George Brewer, was chasing after him. He's trying to cross the Yadkin River. His slave driver is telling him, we cannot cross this river, the river's swollen. He insists, the carriage is taken away, swept up, he dies. The slave and the horses escape, right? That's interesting. The other one is one I found, I was hoping to get to this, but there was a slave during what they say around the Revolutionary period who ran away to a place around Asheville. And they knew about this person, but they couldn't find him. So one of the mountains, they named it actually Negro Mountain. After this enslaved person who had escaped, and they just couldn't find him. Eventually they did, and he was sent back. But this is kind of part of these narratives that when you're finding them, it becomes quite interesting as to what's really happening in some of these stories. And what else could be uncovered if we began to kind of look deeply into these narratives. Yes?
Is there some way we can access the rest of your presentation that we didn't get to see?
Sure. I think they're going to take the PowerPoint. The notes are up under. You have to excuse my notes. This is me kind of thinking through things. But the notes will be available, and you'll be able to see the rest of it. That's fine with me. Yeah. I kind of just dive into...
We're just going to have you back. And part two. Okay. Specifically in Buncombe County, as we talk about resistance and the slavery, to see actual examples of people in Buncombe County. That would be very helpful.
This is an example of a slave runaway ad from Buncombe County, right? So I do have these. So the D's will be a little different because it's not going to always tell the story of resistance. But you will see this in some of the petitions and some of the advertisements. So this is an example of this, of a young boy who actually ran away, right? Again, you'll see this language. He's what? Tolerably bright mulatto.
He's also not young.
Right.
He's 25 to 30.
Yes. Very kinky, right? Very kinky hair, stout built, 6 feet high, high cheekbones, weighs around 190 pounds.
Said boy.
Yes.
Said boy.
Said boy formerly belonged to who? James R. Love. So this is something we'll look for in the slave deeds, right? Is to look for this and to begin to connect what else is happening particularly happening on that plantation, all right? It is believed that he is what? Lurking about in Macon, in Haywood County, or Washington, Tennessee, as he has what? Relatives living in each of the said counties. Again, it's this family aspect that is happening here, right?
Can I ask?
Yes.
So then the ad was taken out by, is that a family member? Is the ad's different from the taken out different?
So sometimes it is what could be happening. There's multiple things. Sometimes he could be hired out, and he's taken out by the person who was hired out, but showing who he belonged to, But this right here, I think, is actually from the slave owner here. Yeah, I think that is the slave owner. This is who he formerly belonged to. But sometimes it is taken out by different people. Sometimes it is taken out by railroad companies, right? Mining companies. Slaves in the mountains actually did a lot of railroad construction, did a lot of mining, particularly during the supposed gold rush of the 1830s. Yes?
Is there any information on how often slaves were mistaken for people? Like a free black that didn't have a pass on them that was said to be a slave and still got sent to a plantation because they didn't have a pass despite being. Do you follow me?
Yes, I haven't ran across any of those. Where you will find some of those, not maybe in the slave ads, but you'll find those in the narratives, right? That is what 12 Years a Slave was about. Charles Ball is kind of an example. And if you're not familiar with Charles Ball's narrative, you might want to read it. He has some very interesting stories of, as he's escaping slavery, his experiences in North Carolina. All right, he crosses North Carolina during the winter, and he has some major problems. Some major problems. He actually falls into the river. He almost freezes to death. He says, I have to decide whether to send myself back into slavery, die, or figure out a way to keep living. All right? Because he knows he's in trouble. He talks about the hypothermia setting in, his limbs becoming stone cold. He talks about this. So Ball has a very interesting and a very exhilarating narrative of him traveling through Western North Carolina. Yes?
What similarities do you find in our current culture or environment in terms of behavior? How people have, even though there's a ton of progress has made, but in terms of behavior, how people treat each other, what common or similar things do you find and still here and needs to be changed?
I think one of the major ones is criminality and how we label criminals. One of the things I'm looking at in my research, some of the cases in the 1980s, where you have a black person who steals a TV from a store, and he's given 10 to 20 years, right, in prison. Whereas a white-collar crime that is committed, that is robbing people of millions of dollars, they may get probation. How we begin to judge criminality is something that I think is major, and the way we label it is major in our society, and we have to be careful with how we look at it. I mean, the recession of 2008 is a prime example of this, when we begin to look at what was happening on Wall Street and this kind of predatory lending, and how all this stuff is kind of swept under the rug, and not, we don't think twice about it, right? So how we label the criminal, I think many historians have brought up the discrepancy in terms of how certain, what's the word? I'm losing my mind here. Epidemics are treated. For instance, the crack epidemic versus the meth epidemic, or the opioid crisis, how those things are kind of judged. All of this labeling plays a role. And what I was trying to demonstrate earlier is that we see how this is being created in our society in the colonial period. And almost all of North Carolina, because we're part of these laws, we kind of embrace these things. We begin to accept them, and it becomes kind of second nature. That's the power of culture. And if I am to leave you anything, is that investigate culture. Understand what it means. Understand that we are creating our worldview based on certain assumptions that we were not taught to question, all right? The way we live, the way we work, right? I remember when I first started working, I was like, wow, why is everybody going to work at the same time? 8 o'clock, there's droves and droves of cars. Everybody's going to their respective places. Why does life have to look like that? For most people, it's just what you do. But questioning these basic assumptions, particularly as students of life and students of the college, I think are important. Because we may actually find new ways to think about certain things, particularly in the sciences, right? Particularly in the sciences. Any other questions? This is another just advertisement from Mountain County, Morganton. I thought this one was also very interesting, where you have a runaway, but it's also noting something very familiar. So he, while in Raleigh, still has a free woman of color for a wife by the name of Jane Tucker. Jane is a small mulatto woman, 25 or 30 years old, and as I'm informed, sustained while in Raleigh, a good character. She followed Richard to Buncombe County and then to this county, Morganton, where she has resided for the last year or so. Again, it's just demonstrating this kind of sense of family that you'll actually see in many of these kind of runaway slave ads. That this free woman of color is following her enslaved husband as he's being kind of sold to different places. And as he's running away, it is noting that what? More than likely, she's making arrangements to return to Raleigh, where I have no doubt her husband would attempt to also get, right?
And I do find it interesting that the relationship is acknowledged.
Yes.
Very forthrightly. There's a wife and a husband.
Yes.
As opposed to a consort.
Yes. That is one of the kind of the interesting things about slavery. You have this duality. They're property, they're people, whenever we need them to be, right? There's this kind of fungibility there. You are what I want you to be in the time I need you to be it. And that's what we kind of see throughout slavery. And that is one of the unique things about slavery that is hard to capture even by writing about it. It is something oftentimes that can't be put into words. How do you actually wrestle with this idea? Essentially, that even when we have our title, People Not Property, it's just, they were property, right? That's the first thing that people really know, but they were property. How do we actually begin to describe all of this stuff? This is something that we're still working through. I'm sure we haven't really situated properly quite yet.
How many people at UNCG are working on this digital library of American slavery along with you?
Well, right now, all hands are on deck for the People Not Property project, but we do have other people kind of helping to develop and finish off like this, the Runaway Slave ads, which is 75% complete, which is mostly David, but Richard also was kind of helping with the court and petition project. So they all have kind of separate projects, but it's all going into the same type of bank. So most of the hands are on the People Not Property project.
Three people?
Yeah, 3 people. And students are also helping with the People Not Property project.
How many students?
At the moment, I think we have 7 students. And also volunteers. I can't leave that out. Volunteers, right, which we need. So I do have, I should put them out, some bookmarks that has information on it. And if you want to volunteer, I do recommend it, even if it's for a little while. Yes.
Are the runaway ads being found by paging through newspaper archives?
So part of the first bunch actually came from a book called Stealing a Little Freedom by Dr. Freddie Parker. He had compiled all of the runaway slave ads. So I think from 1780 to 1840, he had them all from every newspaper in North Carolina. We have just kind of continued his work, and we're finishing it off from 1840 to, I think, 1870.
We know he had them all because we think he's fine.
Referencing, so cross-referencing, you can go back and you'll see exactly that he's using the same. One, because it's about the availability of the newspapers. So we don't always have the original newspapers. We also use a microfilm, many of the things that he's using or had used. And so we're just we can cross-reference and check, which we have done, just to see if he's missing anything or something was off. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad you checked.
And a lot of these newspapers, if you don't know, are now also accessible through the Library of Congress. So that's another way that, kind of help to kind of check some of these records. Brady.
Are they online?
Yes, they are online. Yes.
Thank you, Brian, so much for that wonderful talk and for the work that you and Drew and Deborah are doing on this project. Really appreciate you coming up to Asheville to tell us about this. Also, I just want to point out that we have this original newspaper. It's kind of hidden from you guys, but it's the Cherokee One Feather, which unfortunately does have runaway slave ads. It's in our permanent collection, but if you want to see an original, right there. Enjoy some refreshments, and I'm sure Brian would be happy to answer a few more questions.
Sure.
Thank you all for coming.